At dawn, inside Gate 14B of a private airport terminal, Julian Vance's empire was 11 minutes away from becoming untouchable until he saw the pregnant woman he had once thrown away. "Clara," he whispered, his face draining of color. She stumbled back, one hand shielding her belly, bruises dark around her throat. "Don't come closer. Please. Just let me go." Julian's jaw tightened. "Who did this to you?" Her eyes filled with fear and fury. "Like you don't already know. I know what happens to loose ends in your world." Then she looked him dead in the eye and said the words that shattered him. "She's yours." And before Julian could breathe, the men hunting Clara were already closing in. "Stay with me. Because this is the night a Mafia boss learns that the woman he abandoned may be the only person who can destroy his enemies. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow this story to the very end." Julian Vance did not believe in luck. He believed in variables. Every risk had a number attached to it. Every deal had an exit built into the contract before the ink dried. He had built an empire on that principle, and it had never failed him. It failed him at Gate 14B. The private terminal was quiet at this hour, all glass and polished steel. The kind of place built to make rich people forget that airports exist for everyone else too. Julian stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, watching the runway lights blink against the dark. In 11 minutes, Victoria Sterling's jet would land. In 11 minutes, he would shake her hand, kiss her cheek for the cameras, and finalize the merger that would make Sterling Logistics and Vance Freight the largest shipping network on the East Coast. It was a good deal. A clean deal. Nothing about it required him to feel anything at all. That was the plan, anyway. He noticed her before he understood why he noticed her. A woman near the far wall, moving, one hand pressed flat against her lower back. She wore a coat 2 sizes too big, the kind you buy specifically because it hides things. Her hair was pulled forward over her shoulders, loose, unstyled, nothing like the woman he remembered. But he remembered the walk. He had watched that walk cross his office floor 100 times, carrying spreadsheets, carrying coffee, carrying the particular confidence of someone who was smarter than everyone in the room and knew it. Clara Hayes, his fired forensic accountant, his mistake, his secret. Buried 8 months ago under a business decision he had told himself was necessary. He started walking before he decided to. Up close, the coat wasn't hiding a bad outfit. It was hiding a pregnancy. Far enough along that she moved like every step cost her something. And her collar had shifted just enough for him to see it. A ring of bruising around her throat, purple gone yellow at the edges. Layered, the kind that comes from more than one hand. More than one night, Clara. She turned. For half a second, something in her face opened. Something that looked almost like relief. Then it slammed shut. She stumbled back a step, one arm curling protectively over her stomach. And the look she gave him was not the look you give an old friend. It was the look you give a wall you're about to be thrown against. "Don't," she said. Her voice came out cracked, like she hadn't used it much lately. "Please, just let me go." "Clara, what happened to you?" He kept his voice low. He'd learned that much, at least, from a lifetime of talking men down from doing something stupid. Low and slow. Hands visible. No sudden moves. "Who did this?" "Like you don't already know." Her eyes were wet now, but she wasn't crying. She looked like a woman who had used up her tears somewhere else, in some other room, and had nothing left but the shaking. "I saw the black cars outside. I saw your men by the entrance. You found me. Fine, you found me. Just do it quick. And leave her out of it." Julian felt the ground tilt under a sentence he didn't understand yet. Do what quick, whatever this is. Her hand pressed harder into her belly, like she could shield the baby with nothing but pressure and will. "I know how this works. Julian, I did your books for 3 years. I know what happens to loose ends." For a man who had once negotiated a weapons dispute with a gun pointed at his own head and not blinked, this was new territory. His mouth went dry. His mind, usually a machine that ran the numbers before his mouth ever opened, simply stopped. "You think I'm here to hurt you. I think you're here to finish it." Her voice broke on the last word, and something underneath the fear surfaced. Something sharper. "Anger, you fired me like I was a line item. You think I don't know what it means when a man like you shows up 8 months later at an airport? Out of nowhere, right when I finally almost got away. Clara. He said her name like it was the only word he had left. His eyes dropped, just once, to her stomach, and back up to her face. He needed her to say it. He needed to be wrong. Whose baby? She held his gaze for a long moment. Around them, the terminal kept moving, luggage wheels rattling over tile. A boarding announcement crackling through unseen speakers. A world that had no idea it was about to end for one man standing very still by gate 14B. Yours, Clara said. She's yours. And I have spent every day since you threw me away believing you'd come back to make sure neither of us lived long enough to prove it. The floor did not move. The lights did not flicker. Nothing around Julian Vance changed at all. And that was the worst part. Because everything inside him had just come apart at the seams. And the world kept right on functioning like it hadn't noticed. 8 months earlier, Clara Hayes believed her life only going somewhere. She had spent 3 years climbing the ranks at Vance Freight. First as a junior auditor buried in a windowless office on the 4th floor. Then as the woman Julian Vance called into every meeting where the numbers mattered. She was good at her job, better than good. She could find a missing dollar in a spreadsheet with 10,000 rows the way other people could spot a typo on a billboard. It was a strange kind of talent, invisible to most people. But Julian had noticed it early. And noticing things early was the one skill that had made him rich. They started slow. A late night going over quarterly reports that turned into a conversation about nothing in particular. A coffee that became a habit. A habit that became something neither of them said out loud. Because saying it out loud would have made it real. And real things could be used against a man in his line of work. Clara knew what he was. She wasn't naive about it. She had seen the shipping manifests that didn't match the shipping contents. Had learned early on which questions to stop asking if she wanted to keep her paycheck. But Julian, in the hours that belonged only to the two of them, was different. He listened when she talked. He remembered small things. The name of her childhood dog. The fact that she hated cilantro. The way she always ordered her coffee too hot to drink, and then complained about it being cold 20 minutes later. For a few months, Clara let herself believe that a man could keep two different ledgers inside himself, one for business, one for her. She was wrong, and the day she found out fast. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that detail with total clarity, the way people remember the exact weather on the worst day of their lives. Julian called her into his office at 4 in the afternoon, and she walked in expecting to talk about the Sterling account. Instead, he was standing behind his desk instead of sitting, which was the first sign. Julian Vance never stood when he could sit. Standing meant he wanted the meeting to be short. The Sterling merger is moving forward, he said. No greeting, no coffee offered, just the facts. Delivered like a man reading a press release. Victoria wants a clean house. No irregularities. No history that could complicate due diligence. Clara felt her stomach drop before her brain caught up to why. Okay, what does that mean for me? It means you're a liability. 3 words. That was all it took to erase 3 years and 4 months of her life. Clara stood in front of his desk, waiting for him to say something else. Waiting for the part where he explained that he didn't mean it like that there was context, that this was just business language, and underneath it he still saw her as something other than a risk to be managed. That part never came. You're firing me. I'm protecting both of us. His voice was even, reasonable. That was the part that broke her. The reasonableness of it. Like he'd rehearsed the delivery in a mirror. Severance will be generous. You'll have a clean reference. But effective today. You have no further connection to this company. Or to me, Julian. She said his name like it might still mean something. What about us? He looked at her then, and for 1 second. 1 single second. Something moved behind his eyes. Clara would spend the next 8 months trying to decide if she had imagined it. There is no us, he said. There never was. Not in the way that survives outside this building. I need you gone by the end of the week. Disappear cleanly. It's better for you. Better for you. As if he were doing her a favor. As if 3 years of trust could be filed away under employee offboarding and forgotten by Friday. Clara didn't cry in his office. She had that much pride left. She walked out, collected her things from the fourth floor in a cardboard box that some intern had clearly grabbed from a supply closet, and drove home in silence. Because if she turned on the radio, she was afraid of what song might come on and break her completely. She cried that night, and the night after, and most nights for the following month, until crying stopped feeling like anything at all. It just became something her body did, like breathing, background noise to the actual work of surviving. She was alone, truly alone, in a way she hadn't been since she was 19 and her mother passed. No job, no income. A resume with a 3-year gap that would raise questions she couldn't answer honestly. And underneath all of it, a truth she hadn't told Julian, because by the time she found out, she was already gone from his life and had no idea how to walk back into that office and say the words. She was pregnant, she found out 3 weeks after the firing, sitting on the edge of a bathtub in an apartment she could no longer afford, staring at a plastic stick that had just rearranged the entire shape of her future. For a long time she just sat there, not crying, not laughing, just sitting, doing the math the way she'd done math for Julian's company for 3 years. Except this time the number staring back at her was a due date. And there was no clever accounting trick that could make the columns balance. She thought about calling him. She picked up her phone 4 separate times over the following week and got as far as his name in her contacts before putting it back down. What would she even say? Congratulations. You got what you paid for. A clean exit and a baby you'll never meet. He had made it very clear there was no us. A baby didn't change the math on that. If anything, it made her more of a liability than she'd ever been. So she didn't call. She looked for work instead. Quietly, in the industries adjacent to shipping and logistics, where her skill set actually meant something. And that was when she learned the second brutal lesson of her new life. Julian's reputation didn't end at the door of his own company. Word traveled in his world, fast and without mercy, and within 2 weeks. 3 separate firms that had seemed interested in her resume went cold overnight. Nobody said it out loud. Nobody had to. She had been Julian Vance's. And now she wasn't. And in the circles that mattered, that made her radioactive, by the time Clara returned to the present. Standing in the fluorescent glare of the airport terminal with Julian in front of her, and 8 months of bruises hidden under an oversized coat. All of that history had calcified into something harder than grief. It had become armor. You lost the right to ask when you treated me like surplus inventory, she told him now, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. I am not your property. I never was. And neither is my daughter. Julian flinched. It was small, almost nothing. But Clara had spent 3 years learning to read the tiny movements underneath his composure, and she caught it. A daughter, he said quietly. Yes, Clara wrapped both arms around her stomach. An old habit now, a reflex built from months of needing to protect something the world kept trying to take from her. A daughter you have no claim to. You made that decision the day you called me a liability and had security walk me to my car. I made a mistake. His jaw was tight. Around them, other travelers moved past in a blur, oblivious, dragging suitcases toward gates that led to lives that hadn't been shattered before 9 in the morning. Clara, if I had known. You didn't want to know. She cut him off, and it felt good. Cutting him off felt like the first real power she'd had in months. You wanted clean. You got clean. This isn't clean, Julian. This is what happens after clean. This is a woman alone with bruises on her neck and a baby that kicks like she's angry at the whole world already, and none of it is your business. Because you made sure of that yourself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The overhead speakers crackled with a boarding call for a flight to Chicago. Ordinary, indifferent. A reminder that somewhere in this building people were living lives with none of this weight attached. Who hurt you? Julian finally asked. And this time there was no calculation in his voice at all, just the question, raw and unguarded. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the reasons not to answer. All the ways this information could get her killed faster than silence ever would. But she was tired. Tired of carrying it alone. Tired of flinching at every man who came close. Tired of a fear that had eaten 8 months of her life down to the bone. Damien Cross, she said. The name landed on Julian's face like a physical blow. Clara watched the color drain out of him, Watched a man famous across 3 states for never showing a single crack in his composure go pale in the middle of a crowded terminal. Damien Cross found you. Damien Cross owns me, Clara said. And for the first time since he'd approached her, her voice cracked completely. Or he thinks he does. He's been telling me for months that I belong to him now, that my daughter belongs to him, that the second she's born, she stops being mine. Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides. Clara had seen him angry before, in boardrooms, over broken contracts and stolen shipments. She had never seen anything like this. This wasn't business anger. This was something else entirely. Something that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like it might actually cost him something to control. Tell me everything, he said, right now. From the beginning. Clara glanced toward the terminal doors, toward the gray morning light beyond the glass, and felt the old fear rise up in her chest. The fear that had followed her out of Damien's house and onto a bus and into this airport. The fear that somewhere in this building, someone was watching. Someone was reporting back. Someone was already dialing a number that would end everything. Not here, she said. Not where he can see. And for the first time in 8 months, Julian Vance did something Clara never expected. He didn't argue. He didn't demand. He simply put himself between her and the open terminal, close enough to block a clear line of sight, and said the only thing that mattered. Then we move, now. They moved to a quiet corner near a shuttered gift shop, away from the main flow of foot traffic, where the noise of the terminal dropped to a low hum and Julian's security detail could form a loose, invisible perimeter without drawing attention. Clara sat on a metal, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other resting on the curve of her stomach. Julian crouched in front of her, close but not touching, the way a man approaches a wounded animal he isn't sure will let him near. Start from the beginning, he said again, gentler this time. Clara stared at a spot on the floor for a long moment before she spoke. After you fired me, I applied everywhere. Every logistics firm, every accounting house, every place that might have use for someone who can find a missing decimal point in a shipping manifest. Nobody called back. Not one. I told myself it was the economy, or bad timing, or my own resume. But I knew the truth by week 3. It was your name attached to mine. Nobody wanted to touch anything that used to belong to Julian Vance. Julian's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I burned through my savings in 2 months. Then I burned through what was left of my dignity, calling in favors from people I barely knew. And then Marcus Thorne called me. Marcus, Julian's voice went flat. My Marcus, Clara confirmed. He said he knew a man who needed a forensic accountant. Someone discreet. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about where the money came from or where it was going. He said the pay was good and the work was simple. I was 3 weeks from losing my apartment. Julian, I didn't have the luxury of asking who I'd be working for, Damien Cross. I didn't know that at first. Marcus set up the interview through a shell company. Some import consulting firm with a name so generic I don't even remember it now. By the time I sat across from Damien and understood exactly whose books I'd be keeping, I already needed the job too badly to walk away. I told myself it would be temporary. 6 months. Save enough to leave the state. Start over somewhere Julian Vance had never done business. She laughed. But there was no humor in it. Just something hollow and tired. For the first 2 months, it was almost fine. Damien kept his distance. He was polite in the way powerful men are polite when they still want something from you. I did the work. I found things in his ledgers that made my skin crawl, but I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was just the accountant, that I could keep my hands clean by staying quiet. And then he found out about the baby. Clara nodded slowly. I was barely showing. 4 months as long. Maybe. I'd been careful. Wearing looser clothes. Timing my morning sickness around meetings. But Damien has people watching everyone in his employ, all the time. One of his security men noticed before I even had a chance to say anything myself. What happened? He called me into his office. Very calm, very friendly. At first, he asked who the father was, and I lied. Told him it was an ex from before I ever worked for you. He let it go for about a week. Then he brought me back in, and this time he had a photograph on his desk, a photograph of you and me, from before, walking out of a restaurant together. I don't know how long he'd been watching. I don't know if it was ever about the accounting job at all, or if he'd been circling me from the beginning because of you. Julian's hands, resting on his knees, curled slowly into fists. He told me the truth wouldn't stay hidden, and I should stop insulting his intelligence. And then he told me something that changed everything. He said a child that carries Julian Vance's blood was worth more to him than every ledger I had ever balanced. He said he finally had something you would burn the world down to protect, and I was the one holding it. The terminal around them kept moving, oblivious. But Clara felt like the walls had closed in until it was just her voice, the bench beneath her, and the man crouched in front of her trying very hard to keep his composure intact. He moved me into his estate the next week, told me it was for my safety, for the baby's safety. He called it protection. It didn't feel like protection. It felt like a cage with better furniture. Did he hurt you? Clara's hand drifted, unconsciously, toward the collar of her coat, toward the bruises she'd been hiding since the moment she stepped off the bus that morning. Not at first. At first, it was just control. He took my phone, told me who I could talk to, when I could leave the house, which rooms I was allowed in. He had 2 women watch me at all times, always polite, always smiling, always reporting back to him the second I did anything he hadn't approved. I told myself I could survive that. Control I could survive. I'd survived worse. She paused. Julian waited, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't fill the silence with a question. He just let her get there in her own time. It got worse when I started asking to leave, just for appointments, doctor visits. Nothing dramatic. He said no, every time. And the no started coming with a warning attached, that I should be grateful. That other women in my position didn't get warm beds and doctors on call. That he could make things much harder for me if I kept pushing. Her voice dropped lower. 3 weeks ago, I tried anyway. I climbed out through a side door while his men were distracted with a shipment, and I almost made it to the road. He caught me himself. His own hands, not one of his guards. She reached up and pulled the collar of her coat aside, just enough for Julian to see the full extent of the bruising. Layered rings in different shades of healing, evidence of more than one incident. He said if I ever tried again, he'd make sure I understood exactly what belonging to him actually meant. He said my daughter would grow up learning the same lesson, whether I was alive to teach her or not. Julian was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, in a way that frightened Clara more than shouting would have. How did you get out? Last week, one of his men made a mistake. Left a side gate unlocked during a supply delivery. I don't know if it was carelessness or if someone inside that house actually wanted me to have a chance. I took it. I walked for 6 hours before I found a bus station, and I've been moving ever since. Staying in places I paid for in cash, sleeping wherever I could, trying to get far enough away that he'd lose the trail. Why the airport? Why here? Clara's eyes flicked up to meet his. And for the first time since he'd approached her that morning, something like calculation returned to her expression. The ghost of the sharp, careful woman who used to comb the company's finances line by line. Because I needed a flight far enough away that his reach couldn't follow, and I needed cash to buy the ticket. I had exactly enough. I wasn't looking for you. Julian, I never expected to see you here. I thought I'd finally caught a break. She looked away. I should have known better. Nothing about this has ever been a break. Julian reached out, sleuths, and rested a hand near hers on the bench, not quite touching, leaving the choice entirely to her. How did he always know where you were, before, when you tried to leave the estate, when you tried to hide things from him? It's like he could see through walls. Clara's expression shifted, something colder and more frightened moving across her face. I've wondered about that too. It never made sense. I was careful. I never used my real name for anything, never carried a phone he could trace. And yet every single time I tried to make a move, he was already 3 steps ahead of me, like he had information I never gave him. What are you saying? I'm saying, Julian, that Damien Cross didn't just happen to know my schedule, my habits the exact week I found out I was pregnant, the exact day I tried to run, someone told him. Someone close enough to have access to details that only a handful of people would ever know. She met his eyes, and the fear in them had sharpened into something closer to certainty. Someone in your organization has been feeding him information for months, maybe longer, and whoever it is. They knew things about me that only your inner circle should have known. The color drained from Julian's face for the second time that morning. How long? He asked. Though some part of him already understood, the answer would be worse than he wanted to hear. I heard him on the phone once, before I lost access to overhearing anything at all. He mentioned a timeline. 7 months, he said. 7 months of information, flowing straight from the top of your operation into his hands. Julian rose to his feet slowly, and for the first time since Clara had known him, she watched something shift behind his eyes that had nothing to do with her at all. It was the look of a man doing math in his head, running through every meeting, every deal, every face in his own organization, searching for the one person who had been selling him out from the inside while he stood in boardrooms, making promises he thought were secure. 7 months, he repeated quietly. That's almost exactly when the Sterling negotiations began. Clara watched the realization land on him, watched him connect a thread she hadn't even considered, and understood, with a cold certainty settling low in her stomach, that whatever came next was not going to stay contained to the two of them for very long. You're safe now, Julian said. I promise you that, whatever happens next, nobody touches you again. Not Damien, not anyone connected to him. Clara wanted to believe him. Some small, stubborn part of her, the part that remembered late nights over spreadsheets and a man who once actually listened, wanted very badly to believe him. But 8 months of learning exactly how fast safety could dissolve into nothing had taught her to hold that hope at a distance. Like a hot coal she wasn't ready to close her hand around yet. Julian, a new voice, smooth and familiar, cut across the quiet corner of the terminal. There you are. I've been looking everywhere. Clara's whole body went rigid before she even turned her head. She knew that voice, not from Julian's world, but from something worse. Something she'd heard through walls at Damien's estate late at night, low and careful, always followed by the click of a door closing. Marcus Thorne walked toward them with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had never once doubted his welcome in a room. He wore a suit that fit too well for a man supposedly working logistics. And behind him, spreading out in a loose but deliberate formation, came 6 men in dark coats, each one carrying himself with the stillness of someone trained to be dangerous without needing to prove it. Marcus Julian's voice didn't change, not on the surface. But Clara had spent 3 years learning the difference between Julian relaxed and Julian coiled, and this was very clearly the second one. This isn't a good time. It's never a good time with you lately. Marcus smiled and his eyes drifted toward Clara, lingering just a beat too long, just enough to confirm what she already suspected. He recognized her. He'd expected to find her here, Miss Hayes. It's been a while. You're looking well, considering. Clara's stomach turned to ice. She grabbed Julian's sleeve without thinking, an instinct older than any calculation. The same instinct that had once pulled her toward a side gate at Damien's estate with 6 hours of walking ahead of her and nothing but hope to guide the way. Julian, she whispered. He knows he's been talking to Damien. That voice. I've heard it through the walls. Marcus's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes flickered. And Clara understood in that instant that she'd just confirmed something he'd been hoping to keep hidden a little longer. I have no idea what she's talking about, Marcus said smoothly, addressing Julian as if Clara hadn't spoken at all, as if she were a piece of furniture that had briefly made a noise. Pregnant women say all sorts of things under stress. You know how it is. Marcus. Julian's voice had dropped into something low and dangerous, a register Clara had never heard from him before. Not even in the tensest boardroom negotiations she'd sat through. Why is airport security clearing this concourse? Clara followed his gaze and saw it too, now that he'd pointed it out. Uniformed officers near the far exits, moving travelers along with unusual efficiency, closing off the wide double doors that led toward the main terminal. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were already looking for a trap. A precaution, Marcus said. There's been a security concern. Nothing that concerns you. Julian, why don't you let me take Miss Hayes somewhere more private? She clearly needs medical attention. And I have people who can arrange that discreetly. No, Clara's voice came out sharper than she expected. Sharper than fear usually allowed her to be. I am not going anywhere with you. That wasn't really a request, Marcus said, and for the first time. The smooth mask slipped just enough to show what was underneath. Cold calculation. A man who had already decided how this was going to end and was only waiting for the room to catch up. Clara felt the walls of the terminal press in around her. 6 armed men. Locked exits. A voice she recognized from the worst months of her life, standing close enough to touch. Smiling like this was any ordinary Tuesday. She'd run from Damien's estate through 6 hours of open road and empty fields. And now here it was again. The same trap wearing a different suit, closing in on her in a place she'd thought, for one foolish moment, might finally be safe. She was crushed by the thought before she could stop herself. Julian had walked her over here, away from the crowd, away from witnesses, right into a corner where Marcus could box them in at his leisure. Had this been the plan the entire time? Had Julian's promise of safety only ever been the opening move in handing her back to the man who'd tried to break her? She looked at Julian's face, searching for the answer, and found something there that didn't fit the fear crowding her thoughts. His expression wasn't guilty. It wasn't calculating in the way a man's face looks when a plan is falling perfectly into place. It was furious. Genuinely, dangerously furious. The kind of anger that comes from watching a trap close around someone you're trying to protect and realizing you walked her straight into the range of it. You've made a mistake, Marcus, Julian said quietly. A big one. Bigger than you understand yet. I don't think so. Marcus's men shifted closer, forming a tighter half circle. I think I finally have the leverage I've been waiting on for months. You've gotten sloppy, Julian. Distracted. All those late nights chasing a woman who was never worth the risk. Damien's going to be very pleased with what I hand him today. Clara felt Julian's hand find hers, quick and firm, and something in the grip told her to stay still, to trust the next few seconds even if she didn't understand them yet. Before you make any more mistakes, Julian said, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. You should know I've had Cayman Trust Bank on retainer for 6 years. Account ending 4173, the one you opened under your cousin's name in Grand Cayman. The one that's been quietly filling up every time a shipment of mine goes missing off the books. He leaned in close. Close enough that only Marcus could hear the rest, though Clara caught enough fragments to understand the shape of it. Numbers. A routing code. Marcus's face went white. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice had lost its smoothness entirely. Test me, Julian said. Or don't. Your choice. But if I were you, I'd be far more worried about what I do next than about anything Damien's promised you. For one long, suspended second, nobody moved. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the baby shift inside her. An uncomfortable reminder that whatever happened in the next few seconds, she wasn't the only one whose safety hung in the balance. Then Julian moved. He didn't reach for a weapon. There was no time, and drawing a gun in a terminal full of bystanders would have turned this into a massacre in under 10 seconds. Instead, his free hand found a small device clipped inside his jacket, something Clara hadn't even noticed him carrying, and he pressed it once, hard against the nearest wall panel. The alarm hit like a physical wall of sound, deafening, immediate. Red lights strobing down every corridor as the airport's fire suppression system engaged all at once. Fire doors began dropping from the ceiling in a slow, grinding cascade. And the calm, controlled terminal dissolved into chaos in the space of 3 seconds. Travelers screamed and scattered. Marcus's men, trained for a quiet handoff and nothing like this, broke formation, some reaching for radios, some simply trying to get clear of the falling doors. Move, Julian said, and this time there was no room for hesitation in his voice. He pulled Clara through the crowd, angling toward a side corridor that the fire doors hadn't yet sealed, keeping his body between her and the chaos behind them. Clara ran as best her body would allow, one hand braced under her stomach, the other locked tight in Julian's grip. And behind them she heard Marcus shouting orders that nobody was listening to anymore. They broke through a service exit just as the last fire door slammed down behind them, sealing off the conscious course and everyone still trapped inside it. Cold air hit Clara's face, rain already falling in a fine gray mist, and for a moment she simply stood there, gasping, trying to convince her body that the danger had actually passed. Julian turned back toward the sealed doors, and even through the chaos, even through the alarms still wailing behind the glass, his voice carried with perfect, terrible clarity. "You have until sunrise to run, Marcus," he said, "because when the sun comes up, I'm burying you." Then he turned to Clara, and the fury in his face softened into something else entirely, something closer to the man she'd once believed she knew. "Can you walk?" he asked. "The car's 2 blocks out. I need you to trust me for just a little longer." Clara looked back at the sealed doors one more time, at the flashing red light bleeding through the glass, and then at the man in front of her, soaked in rain, breathing hard, still holding her hand like he had no intention of ever letting go. "I don't have a choice," she said. "Let's go." The rain came down harder once they reached the car, a heavy, steady sheet that turned the parking structure into a blur of gray light and wet pavement. Julian's driver had the armored sedan waiting exactly where he'd left it. Engine running, doors already unlocked. He got Clara into the back seat first, one hand cupped protectively behind her head as she ducked inside, and then slid in beside her, pulling the door shut against the storm. "Go," he told the driver. "Take the service route out. Nothing on the main roads until we're clear of the airport perimeter." The car pulled away smoothly, tires hissing against wet asphalt, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Clara let herself breathe all the way out. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, trying to steady them, and caught Julian watching the movement with an expression she couldn't quite name. Worry, maybe, or guilt. Possibly both. "You're safe," he said again, quieter this time, less like a promise and more like something he needed to hear himself say out loud. Clara didn't answer right away. She watched the airport recede behind them through the rain-streaked window, watched the flashing lights of what she assumed were fire trucks responding to an alarm that had never actually been a fire, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 8 months straight. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief implied the danger was over, and she knew better than that by now. It was something closer to a pause, a breath between one crisis and the next. She reached down and unzipped the canvas bag she'd been carrying since she left Damien's estate. The same bag she'd clutched through 6 hours of walking, through bus terminals and gas station bathrooms and every place she'd stopped to sleep in fits and starts over the last week. Julian watched her hands work at the seams along the bottom lining, watched her pull a small utility knife from an inside pocket and slice carefully along a row of stitches that looked, until that moment, like nothing more than reinforcement for a cheap bag. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Something I should have done months ago," Clara said, and pulled out 4 small flash drives, wrapped individually in plastic and tucked into a hollow compartment she'd sewn into the lining herself, back when she still had access to a needle and thread and enough freedom to use them without anyone watching. Julian stared at the drives in her palm like they might be something dangerous, which, in a sense, they were. "What's on those?" "Everything," Clara said simply. "Every ledger I was forced to keep for Damien. Every shell company. Every offshore account. Every bribe he funneled to city officials to keep his shipments moving through customs without inspection. I didn't just survive that house, Julian. I spent every free hour I had documenting it, copying files onto these drives whenever his security team got sloppy about monitoring the office computer. It took me 5 months to get it all." For a long moment, Julian said nothing. Clara watched something shift across his face. Surprise first, and then something closer to awe. The specific kind of awe a man feels when he realizes that the person he thought he needed to rescue had actually been building her own rescue the entire time, brick by brick, in secret, under conditions that would have broken most people completely. "You did this while he was—" Julian stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence. "While he was controlling every hour of my day. Yes. While 2 of his women watched me eat breakfast and reported back what I said to the mailman. While I was 6 months pregnant and terrified every single day that he'd find out what I was doing and decide the risk of keeping me alive had stopped being worth it." Clara's voice didn't waver as she said it, though her hands still trembled slightly around the small plastic cases. "I wasn't going to just wait for someone to save me. I've never been that kind of person. I built the case against him because it was the only weapon I had access to. And I made sure it was strong enough to end him completely if I ever got the chance to use it. Julian looked at her for a long time. Rain still drumming steadily against the roof of the car. The city lights onto beginning to blur past the windows as they merged onto a quieter road heading north. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the cold, calculating tone she remembered from his office 8 months ago. I treated you as a transaction, he said. I stripped you of your dignity the day I called you a liability and had you walked out of the building like you were dangerous. I told myself it was necessary, that it was just business, that a man in my position can't afford sentiment. I was wrong, Clara, about all of it. Clara closed her hand around the flash drives and turned to look at him directly. And for the first time since the airport, she let him see exactly how much anger was still sitting underneath the fear. Respect is earned through action, not apologies, she said. You can say all the right words right now, in this car, with rain on the windows and a threat behind us. But words are cheap, Julian. I learned that the hard way. What matters is what you do next. Whether you actually see me as a person this time, or just as a problem you finally have the resources to solve. He absorbed that without flinching, which surprised her more than she expected. The old Julian, the one from the office, would have argued, would have defended himself, would have found some clever reframing that put the moral high ground back in his own hands. This man just nodded slowly, like he understood exactly how much he had to prove, and exactly how little his intentions counted for until he'd actually proven it. Then let me start. Tell me what's on those drives. Everything. I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we get to the house. So Clara told him. She walked him through 5 months of forensic work, condensed into the space of a 40-minute drive, her voice steadying as she moved back into familiar territory. The one place where she'd always felt genuinely competent, regardless of what the rest of her life looked like. She explained the shell company's structure. Damien used to launder proceeds from 3 different illegal operations. The false invoicing scheme that ran shipments of contraband alongside legitimate freight. The network of bribed officials at 2 separate ports who looked the other way in exchange for regular deposits into accounts that existed only on paper. She explained how she'd cross-referenced shipping manifests against customs records. How she'd found the pattern nobody else had thought to look for because nobody else had her particular combination of skills and motive. This is enough to end him, Julian said quietly, once she'd finished. Not just weaken him, end him completely, if it gets into the right hands. I know, Clara said. That was always the point. Why didn't you use it already? Why run instead of going straight to the authorities the moment you got out? Clara looked down at the drive still cupped in her palm, and for a moment the fear returned, flickering behind her eyes like a light that hadn't fully gone out. Because the authorities in 3 different jurisdictions are on his payroll, she said. I found their names on the ledgers too. I didn't know who I could trust with this information. And I wasn't going to hand it over to the wrong person and end up dead before it ever saw daylight. I needed to get far enough away first, somewhere safe enough to actually think. You have that now, Julian said. Whatever else is true about me, about what I did to you, I can promise you that. Nobody touches you at my estate. Nobody touches this evidence unless you decide who sees it and when. Clara studied his face for a long moment, searching for the calculation she'd learned to expect from him, the angle, the hidden cost buried somewhere in the generosity. She didn't find it. Not entirely. Though she reminded herself that absence of proof wasn't the same as proof of absence. Once broken as completely as his had broken hers, didn't rebuild itself in the space of a car ride, no matter how sincere the apology sounded. I want to believe you, she admitted. I'm not there yet. I don't know if I'll ever fully be there again, but I don't have a lot of other options right now. And you're the only person in this entire situation who actually has the resources to stop him. That's honest, Julian said. I'll take honest over false comfort any day. The car fell quiet for a while after that, the rain easing slightly as they moved further from the coast. The city lights thinning out into darker stretches of highway lined with trees. Clara rested her head against the window, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the terminal, through the alarm, through the sprint into the rain. She hadn't slept properly in days. Every time she closed her eyes at a bus station or a cheap motel, some part of her brain stayed alert, listening for footsteps, for the particular sound of a car slowing down outside a window, for anything that might mean Damien's people had finally caught up with her. She didn't fully relax now either. Not completely, but for the first time in a long time. Exhaustion won out over vigilance, and her eyes drifted shut somewhere on the highway. Her hand still curled protectively over her stomach even in sleep. Julian watched her for a long moment before looking away, giving her what privacy he could inside the confined space of the car. He pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, a message to his head of security, instructions to lock down the coastal estate, to double the perimeter watch, to run a full sweep for any tracking devices or hidden access points before Clara set foot inside. He was 3 sentences into a second message when the phone buzzed in his hand. An incoming call, lighting up the screen with a name he'd been actively avoiding for the last several hours. Victoria Sterling. Julian glanced at Clara, still asleep against the window, and answered the call in a low voice, angling his body toward the far side of the car. Victoria, you abandoned me on the tarmac. Her voice came through, clipped and furious. Though underneath the anger, Julian could hear something colder, something more calculating. And that was the part that worried him. Victoria Sterling didn't waste emotion on things that didn't serve a purpose. If she was angry, it was because the anger was useful. My jet landed 40 minutes ago, no car, no welcome committee. Just my lawyers standing on an empty tarmac, wondering if the merger they flew across the country to finalize just fell apart. Something came up, Julian said. An emergency. I'll explain when I can. You'll explain now, Victoria said, and her voice dropped into something quieter and far more dangerous. Because I have people watching the airport feeds, Julian, and I know exactly what kind of emergency triggers a full fire alarm evacuation 40 minutes before I'm supposed to land. I also know exactly what car left through the service exit right after. Care to explain why you're currently driving north with a pregnant woman I've never heard of? While my legal team sits in a conference room waiting to sign paperwork you insisted couldn't wait. Julian's stomach tightened. He glanced again at Clara, still sleeping, unaware that the very merger meant to secure both their futures was now unraveling in real time on the other end of a phone call. Victoria, this isn't what it looks like. I don't care what it looks like, Victoria said, her voice suddenly cold and businesslike in a way that unsettled Julian more than her anger had. I care what it costs me. And right now, Julian, I'm tracking your car, and I'm reconsidering every promise you made me about this merger being clean. So you'd better have a very good explanation ready. Because I am not a woman who tolerates being made a fool of in public. The line went dead before Julian could respond. He sat there for a long moment, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to nothing, and felt the weight of 2 separate crises collapsing into a single, unavoidable collision course. He looked at Clara one more time, still asleep, still trusting him with the most fragile thing left in her life, and understood with sudden, cold clarity that the danger she'd walked into at the airport had only just begun to widen. Marcus was out there somewhere, panicked and dangerous. With hours left before Julian's deadline expired, Damien was still hunting. Still convinced he owned both Clara and the child she carried. And now Victoria Sterling, a woman who did not lose gracefully and did not forgive easily, was tracking his exact location with the kind of resources that made hiding almost impossible. Julian set the phone down slowly in his lap and looked out at the rain-soaked road ahead, calculating, the way he always calculated. Except this time, the numbers on every side of the equation were people he might not be able to protect all at once. Faster, he told the driver quietly. We need to be behind the gates before sunrise. The estate sat on a bluff above the coastline, gray stone against a grayer sky. The kind of place built generations ago by people who understood that safety and beauty could occupy the same structure if you had enough money to insist on both. Clara woke as the car passed through the front gates, iron bars swinging open under the watch of 2 guards, who nodded once at the driver and said nothing else. She sat up slowly, disoriented, the last hour of sleep clinging to her like fog. Where are we? Home, Julian said, and then, catching himself, corrected it. My home. You're safe here, Clara. I promise you that much. The house itself rose up out of the mist as they came around the final bend in the drive. 3 stories of dark stone with tall windows lit warm and gold against the gray morning. It looked less like the residence of a man Clara had once watched negotiate a weapons dispute without blinking, and more like something out of a different kind of story entirely. The kind where nothing bad ever happened behind walls that thick. Inside, the transformation continued. A woman in scrubs was waiting in the front hall, introduced simply as Dr. Reyes, Julian's personal physician for over a decade and, more importantly to Clara in that moment, someone with zero connection to anyone in Damien's orbit. She led Clara upstairs to a private room with its own bathroom and a fireplace already burning, and for the first time in 8 months, Clara let herself be examined by someone whose only interest was her actual well-being rather than her usefulness or her value as leverage. The exam took the better part of an hour. Dr. Reyes checked her vitals, checked the baby's heartbeat, checked the bruising along her throat, and noted it carefully in a chart that Clara understood, without being told directly. Would eventually become part of a legal case if she wanted it to be. When it was finished, the doctor sat back and looked at her with an expression that was neither pity nor judgment, just simple professional concern. "You and the baby are both stable," she said. "Given everything you've described, that's something close to a miracle. But you're exhausted, dehydrated, and your blood pressure is higher than I'd like to see this close to your due date. I want you resting, eating real meals. And I want you back in front of me in 48 hours for a follow-up. I don't know how much rest I'm going to get," Clara admitted. "There's a lot happening right now. I understand that," Dr. Reyes said. "But your body doesn't negotiate the way the rest of your life apparently does. Rest when you can. That's not optional. Not at this stage." Clara nodded, too tired to argue, and let herself be led to a hot meal waiting in a small sitting room off the main kitchen. It was simple food, roasted chicken and vegetables. Nothing elaborate. But it was the first meal in weeks that hadn't come wrapped in plastic from a gas station or eaten cold out of necessity, because stopping too long anywhere felt dangerous. She ate slowly, severing it, and for a few minutes allowed herself to sit in front of a fire in a warm room and simply breathe. Julian joined her partway through the meal, having spent the intervening time on the phone with his security team, arranging a full sweep of the property and doubling the guard rotation along the perimeter fence. He looked exhausted in a way Clara had never seen from him before, the composure that used to define every interaction now visibly cracked at the edges. "Marcus hasn't surfaced," he told her, sitting across from her at the small table. "My people are watching every account he has access to, every property he's ever used. Nothing yet. He's either gone completely underground, or he's regrouping somewhere with Damien's help. He'll try to salvage something," Clara said, setting down her fork. "Men like Marcus don't just disappear quietly. He'll want to prove he's still useful, still valuable, before Damien decides he's a liability too." Julian's eyes sharpened at that word. Liability, the same word he'd once used against her. And Clara watched him absorb the echo without saying anything about it. She hadn't meant it as a pointed comment. Not exactly. But she also didn't take it back. "What would you do?" Julian asked, "if you were in his position right now?" Clara considered the question seriously, drawing on 5 months of forced familiarity with how men like Damien and Marcus actually thought. The patterns she'd learned from watching his ledgers and overhearing his conversations through thin walls. "I'd try to find leverage fast," she said. "Something that could still make me valuable to Damien even after failing to deliver me and the baby. Money, probably. Marcus struck me as a man who's motivated primarily by what he can spend, not by any real loyalty to the cause. Which is exactly why I told him I know about his offshore account," Julian said. "I wasn't bluffing at the airport. I've had eyes on that account for months. Ever since the pattern of missing shipments started lining up too neatly with certain deposits. You knew he was compromised, and you kept him close anyway. I suspected. I didn't have proof. Not enough to move on. Suspicion isn't the same as certainty. And accusing an underboss without ironclad evidence is a good way to start inside your own organization before you're ready for one." Julian's jaw tightened. "I should have moved faster. If I had, none of this might have happened to you." Clara didn't offer him easy forgiveness for that, though she also didn't pile on additional blame. She had learned, somewhere in the last 8 months, that most disasters came from a chain of small failures rather than one single villain. And assigning all the weight to Julian alone wouldn't have been entirely fair, even if he deserved a significant share of it. "Can I use your laptop?" she asked instead. "The financial system you use for tracking accounts across your subsidiaries. I want to see something." Julian studied her for a moment, clearly weighing what she might be planning, and then nodded, retrieving a laptop from a locked drawer in his study down the hall. He set it in front of her along with a secure access token, and Clara's fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed and precision that made it obvious, once again, exactly why Julian had valued her so highly before he'd thrown that value away. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, watching numbers and account structures scroll past faster than he could follow. "Marcus's offshore account, the one you mentioned at the airport. You know it exists. I know exactly how it's structured. Because I've seen accounts built the same way in Damien's ledgers dozens of times. Same shell company patterns. Same routing conventions through the Caymans." Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the screen, her focus total in a way Julian recognized from years of watching her work. "If I'm right, this account isn't fully separate from the network I've already documented. It's connected, which means I can reach it." For the next 20 minutes, Clara worked in near total silence, cross-referencing the flash drives from her bag against the financial architecture displayed on Julian's screen, tracing threads of ownership through nested shell companies until she found what she was looking for. A single account, buried 3 layers deep, registered under Marcus's cousin's name, exactly as Julian had described at the airport, holding a balance that made even Julian raise an eyebrow when the number finally appeared on screen. "There," Clara said quietly. "That's everything he's skimmed off your shipments for the last several years. Plus whatever Damien's been paying him for information. All of it. Sitting in one account. Protected by security that assumes nobody outside his own circle would ever have the specific knowledge required to trace it." "Can you actually move that money?" Julian asked. "Or just see it?" Clara's fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a moment, something sharp and satisfied crossed her face. The first genuine confidence Julian had seen from her since the airport. "I built financial traps like this one for a living. Before you decided I was a liability." She glanced at him once, a flash of dry humor cutting through the exhaustion. "This isn't just visible, it's exposed. Watch." Her fingers moved across the keys in a rapid, practiced sequence, initiating a series of transfers that routed the account's entire balance through 4 separate intermediary institutions before finally depositing the full amount into a frozen legal holding account Julian's own compliance team had used previously to seize disputed funds during past litigation. The process took less than 3 minutes. When it finished, Marcus's account balance read 0. "It's done," Clara said, sitting back. "He's broke. Completely. Every dollar he stole from you. Every payment Damien ever made him. Gone, he can't access any of it. And by the time his lawyers figure out where it went, if they ever do, the funds will already be tied up in litigation, holds that could take years to untangle." Julian stared at the screen, then at Clara, something close to disbelief mixed with genuine admiration on his face. "You just ruined him," he said before this war even really started. "I ruined the part of him that made betraying you worth the risk," Clara corrected. "Men like Marcus don't do this for ideology. They do it for money. Take away the payoff, and you take away most of his reason to keep fighting." For a moment, sitting there in the warm light of the study, with rain still falling steadily against the tall windows, something almost peaceful settled over the room. Clara felt, for the first time in months, like more than just a target. She felt useful, capable, dangerous in exactly the way she wanted to be dangerous. Aimed squarely at the people who had spent 8 months trying to convince her she had no power left at all. That peace lasted less than 20 minutes. The first sign was small, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. A flicker in the lamp beside the fireplace, there and gone in half a second. Clara noticed it because months of living under Damien's constant surveillance had trained her to notice small things. The kind of details most people's brains filtered out as irrelevant. Julian, he looked up from his phone, already halfway through dialing his head of security. The lights just flickered, before he could answer. The study went dark entirely. Along with every other light, Clara could see through the hallway beyond the open door. The steady hum of the house's electrical systems, background noise so constant she'd stopped noticing it hours ago, went silent all at once. Somewhere deeper in the house, an alarm that should have triggered immediately upon any unauthorized breach stayed completely, ominously quiet. Julian was on his feet instantly. Phone pressed to his ear, already barking orders into a line that had gone dead the moment he tried to speak. "The perimeter system is down," he said, his voice tight with a controlled panic Clara had never heard from him before. "All of it. Cameras, alarms, the gate locks. Someone just took the entire security grid offline at once." Clara felt ice settle into her chest, cold and absolute. The specific fear of a trap closing shut around her for the second time in one single day. "Marcus," she said. "He gave Damien the codes. He'd need administrator access for that," Julian said, already moving toward the study door. Pulling Clara up from her chair with one hand while reaching for a weapon secured beneath the desk with the other. "Access only a handful of people in this house actually have. You just made him desperate enough to burn everything down on his way out," Clara said, her voice shaking now despite her best effort to keep it steady. "You took his money. You told him he had until sunrise. He doesn't have anything left to lose. Julian and men with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous kind there is." Outside, beyond the tall windows now reflecting nothing but darkness, the first distant sound reached them through the storm. Not thunder. Something sharper, more mechanical. The unmistakable rhythm of vehicles approaching fast along the coastal road. Engines cutting through the rain with the kind of urgency that only ever meant one thing. Julian pulled Clara toward the hallway, toward the reinforced stairwell that led down to the panic room built into the estate's original foundation. And for the first time since the airport, his voice carried an edge of real fear. "We need to move." Now, the stairwell to the panic room ran through the original stone foundation of the house, narrow enough that Julian had to angle his shoulders to fit. One hand braced against Clara's back to steady her on the uneven steps. Emergency lighting kicked in somewhere below. Dim red bulbs mounted every few feet along the wall, just enough to navigate by without illuminating their exact position to anyone who might already be inside the house. "How many men does Damien usually send?" Julian asked, voice low, moving fast despite the darkness. "For something like this, 6, maybe 8. He doesn't like relying on overwhelming numbers. He prefers precision, small teams, fast entry, minimal noise until it's too late for anyone to organize a real defense." Clara's hand gripped the stone wall for balance, her breathing already labored from the stairs, and the tight coil of fear sitting low in her stomach. "He'll have someone watching the main approach, and someone covering whatever secondary exit he thinks you'd use. He's thorough." He wouldn't have sent them without confidence that Marcus's information was solid. They reached the bottom of the stairwell just as the first sound of impact reached them from somewhere above. A heavy, splintering crash that could only have been a door coming off its hinges. Julian froze for half a second, listening, calculating distance and direction with the same instinct that had once made him one of the most feared men in his industry. "Front entrance," he said. "That buys us maybe 90 seconds before they clear the main hall." He pulled Clara down a side corridor Clara hadn't noticed on the way in, narrow and unlit except for the same emergency bulbs, leading toward a section of the house she assumed served as staff quarters or storage. Halfway down the hall, gunfire erupted somewhere above them, sudden and deafening even through several feet of stone and wood, and Clara flinched hard enough that Julian's arm shot out instinctively to keep her from stumbling. "That's my security team engaging," Julian said. "They'll hold as long as they can. As long as they can isn't the same as long enough," Clara said, and Julian didn't argue the point, because they both understood it was true. The gunfire continued in bursts as they moved, sometimes close, sometimes muffled by distance and walls. An unpredictable rhythm that made every step forward feel like walking through a minefield with no way to see where the danger actually sat. Clara kept one hand pressed against her stomach, feeling the baby shift and kick in response to the noise. An unbearable reminder that whatever happened in the next few minutes, there were 2 lives depending on her ability to keep moving despite the fear locking up every muscle in her body. They rounded a corner and nearly collided with one of Julian's security men, blood soaking through the shoulder of his jacket. Weapons still raised and ready despite the injury. "Sir, they're through the east wing," the man reported, breathing hard. "At least 6 shooters, moving in a coordinated pattern. This isn't a smash and grab. They know the layout. Someone gave them the floor plan," Julian said grimly. Marcus again. He'd have access to the original architectural files from when I had the panic room installed. "Get to the vault." "Sir, I'll try to slow them down at the stairwell junction." Julian gripped the man's good shoulder for a brief second, a gesture that carried more weight than words could have managed in that moment, and then pulled Clara forward again, deeper into the maze of corridors leading toward the reinforced heart of the estate. They were 50 feet from the panic room door when the second catastrophe arrived, though it announced itself not with gunfire but with the distant, unmistakable roar of engines crashing through something solid. The front gates, Clara realized. Someone had just driven straight through them. "That's not Damien's style," Julian said, confusion cutting through the tension in his voice. "He doesn't announce himself like that." They reached a window at the end of a short side hallway, and through the rain-streaked glass, lit by headlights sweeping across the front drive, Clara saw a convoy of black SUVs pulling to a hard stop across the ruined remains of the front gate. Men and women poured out in tactical vests, several of them clearly marked with the kind of official lettering that made Clara's stomach drop even further than it already had. "Federal agents," she said, "Julian. Those are federal agents." "That's not possible," Julian said, though his voice had gone tight and strange, calculating something new and unwelcome. "Nobody's supposed to know about tonight. Nobody outside my own security detail." A figure stepped out from the lead vehicle, moving with the sharp, purposeful stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly, and even through the rain and darkness. Clara recognized the silhouette from photographs she'd seen years ago, back when she still worked in Julian's office and occasionally handled paperwork connected to the Sterling account. "Victoria," Julian breathed. "She tracked your car," Clara said, remembering the earlier phone call Julian had mentioned in passing during the drive. Back when it had seemed like a manageable problem rather than an active crisis unfolding in real time. "She followed you here and brought federal agents with her," Julian said, disbelief mixing with something sharper, something closer to betrayal. "Corporate lawyers don't travel with tactical teams. Clara, she's here to arrest me." Breach of contract. Probably wrapped in something bigger. She must have decided the merger was compromised the moment she realized where I actually went. Behind them, the gunfire intensified, closer now, moving through the house in their direction with the kind of urgency that meant Damien's men had located their approximate position. Ahead, through the window, Victoria Sterling's federal escort began moving toward the breached front entrance with weapons raised, walking directly into a firefight they had no way of anticipating. "They're going to walk right into Damien's men," Clara said, horror dawning as she understood the full shape of the collision about to occur. 3 different groups, all converging on the same house. None of them expecting the other 2 to be here. Julian's face had gone pale, the calculating stillness he usually wore during crisis replaced by something closer to genuine dread. "This isn't a rescue anymore. This is a crossfire waiting to happen. And we're standing right in the middle of it." He pulled Clara away from the window, back toward the panic room corridor, moving faster now, urgency overriding caution. They made it another 20 feet before the world around them erupted. The explosion came from somewhere near the east wing, a deep, concussive blast that Clara felt in her chest before she registered the sound of it. The entire hallway shuddering as dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. She lost her footing entirely, one hand flying out to catch the wall, and pain lanced through her lower abdomen so sharp and sudden that she cried out before she even understood what was happening. "Clara." Julian caught her before she hit the ground fully, one arm wrapping around her shoulders, the other bracing beneath her, and through the ringing in her ears and the dust still settling around them, Clara heard herself screaming, a sound torn out of her by pain unlike anything she'd experienced before, deeper and more insistent than the aches and bruises Damien had left behind. "Something's wrong," she gasped, both hands now pressed hard against her stomach. tears streaming down her face as another wave of pain rolled through her, tightening everything below her ribs into a vice she had no way to escape. Julian, something's wrong. It's too early. It's too early. Julian's face, already pale from the chaos surrounding them, went white with a different kind of fear entirely. The kind that had nothing to do with gunfire or federal agents or the empire crumbling around him. And everything to do with the woman in his arms and the child neither of them had properly prepared to lose control of like this, in the middle of a war he had brought, however unwillingly, directly to her door. "Stay with me," he said, gathering her up as gently and quickly as the circumstances allowed, gunfire still echoing through the walls. Victoria's agents shouting orders somewhere near the ruined front entrance. The entire structure of his carefully built empire collapsing in real time around the one thing he had finally decided actually mattered. "Clara, stay with me. We're almost there. Just hold on." Another explosion rocked the foundation, closer this time, and Clara's scream tangled with the sound of collapsing stone. The two catastrophes merging into a single unbearable moment that neither of them had any way to stop, only survive. The panic room door stood 20 feet away when Clara's legs gave out entirely. Another contraction rolling through her with a force that stole every ounce of air from her lungs. Julian half carried, half dragged her the remaining distance, kicking the reinforced door open with his shoulder, and pulling her inside just as another round of gunfire erupted somewhere close enough to rattle dust from the ceiling above them. The room itself was small but solid, steel walls a foot thick, a single bench along one side, a bank of monitors showing feeds from cameras that had gone dark hours ago when the security grid failed. Julian eased Clara down onto the floor, propping her against the bench, his hands shaking as he pulled off his jacket and folded it beneath her head. "How far apart?" he asked, his voice tight, with a panic he was fighting hard to keep out of it, the contractions. "How far apart are they? I don't know." Clara gasped, another wave already building beneath the last one's retreat. 4 minutes, maybe less, Julian, it's too early. She's not supposed to come for another 6 weeks. I know. But panic isn't going to help either one of you right now. He knelt beside her, taking her hand. And for a moment, the ruthless businessman who had once fired her with 3 cold words disappeared entirely, replaced by a man doing the only math that mattered anymore. The math of keeping 2 people alive through the next few minutes. "Dr. Reyes is still in the house. I need to get her here. You can't leave," Clara said, gripping his hand hard enough to leave marks. "There are people shooting each other 20 feet from this door." "I know that too." Julian's jaw tightened, and Clara watched him weigh an impossible decision in real time. The empire he'd spent 15 years building crumbling above them, while the woman he'd once discarded as a liability labored on the floor of the one room in his entire estate built to keep threats out rather than let anyone leave. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm calling her instead." He pulled out his phone, hands still steady despite everything, and dialed a line that connected directly to the doctor's private cell. It rang twice before Dr. Reyes answered, her voice tight with her own version of the chaos unfolding through the house. "What is happening out there? Clara's in labor. Premature. Active contractions 4 minutes apart. I need you to talk me through what to do if you can't get here in time." A beat of silence. Then the doctor's voice sharpened into something focused and clinical, the sound of a professional setting fear aside to do the only job that mattered. "Where are you exactly?" "The panic room. Sublevel 2. I'm 2 floors up. Pinned down in the east hallway with 2 of your security men. I don't know if I can get to you safely right now." Gunfire crackled through the phone speaker, confirming the danger without need for further explanation. "Julian, listen to me carefully. If this baby comes before I reach you, you are going to have to manage the delivery yourself. Can you do that?" Julian looked at Clara, at the sweat already beading on her forehead, at the fear and determination fighting for space behind her eyes. And something in him settled into a terrible, necessary calm. "Tell me what to do." Dr. Reyes walked him through it in rapid, clipped instructions, the physical setup, what to watch for, how to time the contractions. What complications to listen for that would mean they needed help regardless of the danger outside the door. Julian repeated each instruction back, memorizing it the way he'd once memorized shipping manifests and contract clauses. Except this time, the stakes made every previous negotiation of his career look small by comparison. Above them, the firefight continued in waves, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough that Clara flinched with every burst. Her body caught between the physical demands of labor and the primal fear of violence closing in from every direction. Stayed beside her through it all, one hand gripping hers, the other pressed to her back, offering the only steadiness he had left to give. "Talk to me," Clara said between contractions, her voice raw. "Please. I need to think about something other than this." Julian searched for something. Anything that might pull her attention away from the pain and the gunfire, and the very real possibility that neither of them would walk out of this room the same way they walked in. "When I was 12, he said my father took me on my first shipment run, legitimate cargo, back before things got complicated. I remember being terrified of the ocean, of how big it was, how easily it could swallow a boat and never give it back. He told me something I've never forgotten. He said fear only controls you if you let it make the decisions instead of your training. Did that work for you?" "Eventually. It took years." Julian squeezed her hand as another contraction hit. Watching her breathe through it, with a discipline he found himself admiring even in the middle of chaos. "You're doing better than I ever did at 12. And you're doing it while actively giving birth in a bunker." A weak, exhausted laugh escaped her, quickly swallowed by another contraction. But it was something, a small crack of humanity in the middle of the worst night either of them had ever lived through. Above them, the sound of the firefight shifted, new voices entering the chaos, sharp commands in the clipped, authoritative tone Clara had heard only once before. Back at the airport, when federal agents had been mentioned as a looming threat rather than an active presence, Victoria's people engaging directly now, adding a third front to a battle that had already spiraled far beyond anything Julian's security detail had been prepared to handle alone. "They're all fighting each other up there," Clara said, another contraction cresting and receding. "Damien's men, your security, Victoria's agents. 3 separate wars is happening at once. And we're stuck down here in the middle of all of it." "Not stuck," Julian said. "Protected. This room was built for exactly this kind of scenario. Whatever's happening up there, it can't reach us in here." He was wrong within the hour, though neither of them knew it yet. The panic room door, reinforced against conventional breach methods, had one vulnerability that Julian had never fully accounted for. A vulnerability that existed only because Marcus Thorne had personally overseen its installation years earlier and knew every weakness built into its design. When the door finally gave way, it wasn't through brute force or explosives, but through a manual override sequence Marcus had devised specifically for a moment like this one. A betrayal built into the very walls meant to keep Clara safe. The door slid open with a mechanical groan just as Victoria Sterling herself rounded the corner outside, flanked by 2 federal agents, weapons drawn. Moving through smoke and debris with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years learning not to flinch at chaos, she stopped hard at the threshold of the panic room, taking in the scene inside with an expression that shifted rapidly from confusion to something far more complicated. Julian kneeling on the floor, jacket sleeves rolled up, hands steady despite everything. Clara pale and sweating, deep in the throes of active labor. Bruises still visible around her throat despite the chaos of the last several hours. "Julian," Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of genuine shock that cut through her earlier fury entirely. "What is this?" "Not now, Victoria." Julian's voice was sharp, protective, positioning himself slightly between Clara and the door, without breaking his focus on the woman laboring in front of him. "Whatever you came here to say, whatever arrest you're planning to make, it can wait." Victoria's eyes moved from Julian to Clara, then down to the visible bruising around her throat. And something in her expression hardened into a different kind of calculation entirely. One Clara hadn't expected from a woman she'd assumed was here purely as an adversary. "Who did that to her?" Victoria asked, her voice suddenly quiet and dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with contract law or corporate mergers. "Damien Cross," Julian said. "He's the reason this house is currently under siege. He wants her back, and he wants the child she's carrying, because that child is mine." For a long moment, Victoria said nothing. processing the information with the same cold efficiency she likely applied to every deal she'd ever negotiated. Clara watched her, bracing for judgment, for the soap opera confrontation she half expected between the fiancé and the mistress. The scene where pride and jealousy took center stage regardless of the actual crisis unfolding around them. It never came. Damien Cross kills children when they're inconvenient to him, Victoria said instead, her voice clipped and businesslike. I've seen the intelligence reports. He's a toxic asset, Julian. The kind that destroys everyone connected to him eventually. If he's out there right now trying to reclaim a pregnant woman and an unborn child, that's not a personal matter between the three of us. That's a threat that needs to be neutralized immediately. She turned to the federal agents flanking her, and her next words carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without hesitation. Redirect all units. I want every weapon in this house turned on Damien Cross's people, not Vance's security detail. This merger dispute is suspended until further notice. Right now, we have a pregnant woman in active labor and a predator trying to reach her. That takes priority over everything else. One of the agents hesitated, clearly expecting different orders given the circumstances that had brought them to the estate in the first place. Ma'am, our warrant was for I said redirect. Victoria snapped. I'll take full responsibility for the operational change. Move, the agents moved instantly. Radios crackling as new orders spread through the house. And Clara felt something shift in the air even through the haze of pain and exhaustion. A subtle change in the rhythm of the gunfire above them. Less chaotic now, more coordinated. Three separate forces suddenly aligning against a single common threat. Why, Clara managed to ask, her voice barely more than a whisper between contractions. Why, help me. You have every reason to walk away and let this happen. Victoria knelt down beside her, and for a moment the sharp, calculating businesswoman softened into something more human, something that suggested her cold pragmatism wasn't the whole story of who she was. Because I've spent my entire career building things that last, Victoria said quietly. And nothing lasts on a foundation of violence against people who can't protect themselves. Julian made a mistake with you. That's obvious now, and it's not my place to litigate it in the middle of a firefight, but whatever he did wrong. You don't deserve what's happening to you tonight, and neither does that baby. Another contraction hit, harder than the last, and Clara's cry cut through whatever conversation might have continued between them. Dr. Reyes appeared moments later, having finally fought her way down through the chaos with Victoria's agents clearing a path, and the room shifted immediately into focused, practiced urgency. The doctor taking over with calm authority, while Julian's stayed anchored at Clara's side, refusing to let go of her hand even as the real work of the delivery began. Outside, through the reinforced door still standing open, the sound of the battle continued, sharper now, more decisive. Three forces that had arrived, as enemies finding unexpected common ground against the one man who threatened all of them equally. Somewhere in that chaos, Damien Cross was still coming, and everyone in the panic room understood that whatever peace this fragile alliance had bought them, it wouldn't hold for long. The alliance bought them almost 40 minutes. Clara would remember later that it felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Labor pains stretching each second into something unbearable, while the actual clock raced forward far faster than her body was prepared to handle. Dr. Reyes worked with quiet efficiency, monitoring every contraction, every change in Clara's vitals. While outside the reinforced door, the sound of gunfire gradually shifted from chaotic to focused. Three allied forces slowly pushing back against Damien's remaining men. It wasn't enough. Julian heard him before he saw him. A voice he recognized instantly from years of business dealings that had always stopped just short of open warfare. Smooth and controlled even now. Even with his operation clearly falling apart around him. Julian Vance. Damien Cross said, stepping into the doorway of the panic room with Marcus Thorne held in front of him, one arm locked around the man's throat, the other pressing a pistol against his temple. Marcus was bleeding heavily from a wound in his side, barely conscious. His usual polished confidence reduced to something pale and terrified. I have to say, this is not how I imagined finding you tonight. Let him go. Damien Julian rose slowly from Clara's side, positioning his body as a barrier between the door and the woman still laboring on the floor behind him. This is between you and me. He's not worth the trouble of carrying around. Oh, I agree completely. Damien's voice carried a cold, almost pleasant amusement that made Clara's skin crawl even through the haze of pain. He failed me tonight, Julian, badly, but he still makes a useful shield, don't you think? Until I've finished what I came here to do. His eyes moved past Julian, finding Clara on the floor, and something predatory flickered across his expression. The same look Clara remembered from months of captivity. The look of a man who genuinely believed ownership was simply a matter of asserting it loudly enough. There you are, Damien said, almost gently. I've been very worried about you. Clara, running off like that in your condition. Very reckless. Don't talk to her, Julian said, his voice dropping into something dangerously quiet. I'll talk to whoever belongs to me, Damien replied, aiming the pistol away from Marcus' temple just long enough to gesture toward Clara with it. A casual, careless movement that made Julian's entire body go rigid with barely restrained fury. And that includes the child she's about to deliver. My child now, as far as anyone outside this room needs to know. I've already prepared the paperwork. Clara felt another contraction building, deep and relentless. But underneath the physical agony, something else was rising too, something sharper and colder than fear. She had spent 5 months documenting every crime this man had ever committed, every life he'd destroyed. Every ledger entry that proved exactly what kind of monster stood in that doorway threatening her family. She was done being afraid of him in silence. You're not taking anything, Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. Not me, not her. You never owned either of us. Damien, you just convinced yourself you did. Because that's the only way men like you understand power. Damien's smile faltered, just slightly, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. You always did talk too much for someone in your position. My position, Clara repeated. And despite the pain racking her body, despite the gun pointed generally in her direction, she felt something steady settle into her voice. The same steadiness that had carried her through 5 months of secretly building a case against him under his own roof. You mean the position of the woman who spent 5 months documenting every single crime you've ever committed, every shell company, every bribed official. Every shipment you ran through customs with a payoff attached. The color drained slightly from Damien's face, though he tried to cover it with a dismissive laugh. Empty threats don't scare me. Clara, they're not empty. Julian reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, pulling out the tablet he'd brought down into the panic room hours earlier. Still connected to the estate's backup network despite the security grid failure above. He held it toward Clara without breaking eye contact with Damien. She's not bluffing. I've seen the files myself, Doctor. Reyes glanced up sharply, clearly torn between the medical crisis in front of her and the standoff unfolding at the doorway. But she said nothing, understanding on some instinctive level that interrupting this particular confrontation might cost them all far more than staying silent. Clara took the tablet with trembling hands, another contraction rolling through her, even as she forced her fingers to move across the screen. Pulling up the folder she'd built and rebuilt across 5 stolen hours a week for 5 agonizing months. Every file was there, exactly as she'd left it, backed up automatically the moment the tablet connected to Julian's network. You want to know what real power looks like? Damien. Clara's voice cracked with pain and adrenaline in equal measure. But she didn't stop, didn't slow down. It's not a gun in a doorway. It's information. Every account you've ever hidden, every official you've ever paid off, every shipment of contraband you've ever run under the cover of legitimate freight. It's all right here. You're lying, Damien said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned considerably. Clara's thumb hovered over a button labeled Send. Connected to a distribution list Julian had helped her build in the chaotic minutes before Damien arrived. A list that included the Syndicate Council overseeing organized operations across 3 states, along with a direct, encrypted line to national law enforcement channels that even Damien's bribed officials couldn't intercept in time. Let Marcus go, right now, and get out of this house. And maybe I reconsider. Or don't, and in 1 second. Everything you've built for the last 15 years disappears. Damien's grip on Marcus tightened, his eyes flicking between Clara's face and the tablet in her hands, calculating odds the way men always calculated odds. Weighing risk against reward with the cold detachment of someone who had survived this long, precisely because he never let emotion cloud a decision. "You wouldn't," he said. "Not with that gun pointed at the man who betrayed your precious Julian. Not while you're literally giving birth on the floor in front of me." "Watch me," Clara said, and press the button. The upload took less than a second. A quiet, unremarkable chime confirming the transfer had completed. But the effect on Damien was immediate and total. His phone, tucked into his jacket pocket, began buzzing violently, followed almost instantly by a second phone. Then a third. An entire network of burner devices erupting with calls and messages all at once as the ledgers hit inboxes across 3 states simultaneously. Damien's composure shattered in real time. His grip on Marcus loosened as he fumbled for the nearest phone, reading a message that visibly drained the last of the color from his face. His empire collapsing in the span of a single confirmed transmission. "What have you done?" he whispered. And for the first time since Clara had known him, fear replaced the predatory confidence that had defined every interaction between them. "I ended you," Clara said, another contraction hitting so hard she nearly lost the thread of her own words. "Everything you built off the backs of people you controlled and terrified. It's over. Right now." For one suspended second, Damien stood frozen in the doorway, torn between the collapsing wreckage of his criminal network and the immediate threat still standing directly in front of him. It was exactly the opening Julian had been waiting for. He moved fast, faster than a man his size should have been able to move, closing the distance to the doorway before Damien's attention fully snapped back to the room. Julian's shoulder collided with Damien's gun arm, driving it upward and away from Marcus's head just as the weapon discharged, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the reinforced ceiling. Marcus collapsed sideways, freed from Damien's grip, and Julian's fist connected hard with Damien's jaw, sending him staggering back through the doorway into the corridor beyond. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, precise and controlled rather than wild, and Damien dropped to the floor, screaming. One bullet through his kneecap, the other through his shoulder. Neither wound fatal, but both immediately and completely incapacitating. Julian stood over him, chest heaving, weapon still raised. And for a long moment nobody in the room moved at all. "You're finished," Julian said quietly, looking down at the man who had spent months terrorizing the woman he loved. "Your empire's gone, your reputation's gone. Every official who ever protected you just got a very compelling reason to distance themselves before this reaches the news. You have nothing left, Damien, nothing." Behind them, cutting through the tension and the smoke and the lingering echo of gunfire, a new sound emerged, small and piercing and unmistakably alive. A cry thin at first, then stronger, filling the panic room with a sound that overwrote every other noise in the world for the 3 people who understood exactly what it meant. Julian turned, weapon lowering slowly to his side, and found Dr. Reyes holding a tiny, impossibly small baby wrapped hastily in Julian's own jacket, her face scrunched and furious, crying with the full force of newborn lungs meeting open air for the first time. "She's here," Dr. Reyes said, relief flooding her voice. "Early, small, but breathing well on her own. Clara, she's breathing well." Clara reached for her daughter with shaking hands, tears finally breaking free after months of holding them back. And Julian crossed the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling beside them both, forgetting entirely about the man bleeding out on the floor behind him, forgetting about the war still technically raging somewhere above the sublevel, forgetting everything except the small, furious, perfect sound of his daughter's first cry, filling a room that had been built to withstand violence and had instead become the place where his entire life finally reorganized itself around something worth protecting. "She's beautiful," he whispered, voice breaking. "Clara, she's beautiful." Clara looked up at him, exhausted and tearful and, for the first time in 8 long months, genuinely, fully safe, and allowed herself, just for that moment, to believe that the worst of it might finally be over. 6 months later, the estate looked nothing like the war zone it had briefly become. The East Wing had been fully rebuilt, the shattered front gate replaced with something less imposing but just as secure. And the panic room that had once witnessed the worst night of Clara's life now sat quiet and unused several floors below a house that had slowly, carefully, become something closer to an actual home. Julian sat cross-legged on a plush rug in the sunlit nursery, his daughter perched between his knees. Her dark hair just long enough now to gather into two small, uneven braids that he worked at with far more concentration than the task probably required. He had watched a tutorial video 3 times the night before, determined not to show up to this particular task unprepared. And his fingers, so accustomed to signing contracts and closing deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime, moved with careful, deliberate patience through his daughter's hair. Hold still. Sophie, he murmured. And the baby, 7 months old, now and utterly unbothered by his instructions, reached up and grabbed a fistful of his shirt instead, gurgling with delight at whatever private joke occupied her small, expanding universe. It was a strange transformation to witness, even for the people who knew him best. The man who had once fired the mother of this child with 3 cold words, who had built an empire on calculation and distance, now spent his mornings on nursery floors, learning the specific, patient work of braiding hair too fine to hold a shape for more than an hour at a time. He didn't do it because anyone was watching. He did it because somewhere in the last 6 months, being present for these small, unglamorous moments had become the actual measure of the man he wanted to be, not the ledgers, not the contracts, not the reputation he'd spent 15 years building on fear. The legitimate merger with Sterling Logistics had finalized 3 months ago. Stripped of every illegal operation Julian had once quietly run alongside his legal freight business. Victoria Sterling had insisted on that condition personally, standing in his study with the same cold, businesslike clarity she'd shown the night of the siege, telling him flatly that she wasn't interested in building anything with a man who couldn't fully separate himself from his past. Julian had agreed without hesitation. He'd spent 15 years telling himself that a certain amount of corruption was simply the cost of doing business in his world. Watching Clara give birth on the floor of a panic room while 3 separate armies fought outside the door had cured him of that particular illusion permanently. Damian Cross was serving the first of what would eventually total 43 years across multiple federal convictions. The evidence Clara had built against him proving more than sufficient to end not just his own operation, but 3 others connected to it through the shell company network she'd painstakingly traced. Marcus Thorne had taken a plea deal in exchange for testimony against his former employer, though Julian had made it clear, through channels that didn't require explicit threats, that Marcus would never again find work in any legitimate industry connected to shipping or logistics for the rest of his life. Down the hall from the nursery, in a converted sitting room that had once hosted quiet business meetings, Clara sat across from a woman who couldn't have been older than 25, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed the floor in a posture Clara recognized immediately, having spent months holding herself the exact same way. "You don't have to talk today," Clara said gently. "Sometimes just sitting in a room where nobody's going to hurt you is enough for the first visit." The young woman looked up, surprised, and Clara offered her a small, understanding smile, the kind that came only from having lived through exactly this kind of fear herself and knowing, from the inside, how much courage it took just to walk through the door. "How did you know?" the woman asked quietly. "How did you know it was time to leave?" Clara considered the question for a long moment, choosing her words carefully, aware that whatever she said next might genuinely matter to someone standing at the edge of a decision she understood better than most. "I didn't know all at once," Clara said. "It happened slowly, in pieces. First, I noticed that I'd stopped recognizing my own choices. Every decision I made had somehow become his decision instead, and I couldn't remember exactly when that shift happened. Then I noticed I was apologizing constantly for things that weren't actually my fault, just to keep the peace. And then, one day, I realized I was more afraid of staying than I was of leaving. And that was the moment everything finally changed." The young woman's eyes filled with tears, and Clara reached across the small table between them, offering her hand without pressure, letting the choice to take it remain entirely with the woman across from her. "You are safe here," Clara said softly. You belong to no one but yourself. No one is collateral damage. Not in your own life, and not in anyone else's plans for you. Whatever choice you make next, it has to be yours, made with clear eyes. Not made for you by someone who's convinced you that fear is the same thing as love. The foundation Clara had built over the last 4 months. Funded initially by a portion of the frozen assets seized from Damien's dismantled network, and now sustained by a mixture of grants and private donations, had already helped 17 women find their way out of situations that had once felt, to each of them, entirely inescapable. Clara ran it with the same precision she'd once brought to forensic accounting, tracking outcomes, refining resources, treating every case with the seriousness of a problem that deserved a genuinely rigorous solution rather than well-meaning but ultimately empty sympathy. She held the young woman's hand for a long moment, offering silent presence rather than more words. And eventually the woman's shoulders began to loosen, just slightly. The first small sign of attention that had likely been building for months finally starting to release. The door opened quietly behind them, and Julian stepped in carrying 2 mugs of coffee, careful not to interrupt whatever fragile progress was unfolding in the room. He set one mug down beside Clara without a word and, instead of lingering or inserting himself into a conversation that clearly wasn't his to be part of, stepped back toward the doorway, content simply to watch from a respectful distance. Clara glanced up and caught his eye, and something passed between them that had taken 6 months of careful, deliberate work to rebuild. Trust reconstructed one honest conversation at a time. Respect earned through consistent action rather than declared through empty promises. Julian didn't try to take over the meeting. Didn't try to fix the young woman's situation with money or intimidation, the way the old version of himself might have instinctively reached for. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before that night in the panic room, that some kinds of power only mattered when you knew exactly when not to use them. He caught Clara's eye and offered a small, private smile before slipping back out into the hallway, leaving the 2 women to their conversation, understanding that his role here was support, not leadership, presence rather than control. Later that evening, after the young woman had left with a folder of resources and a promise to return the following week, Clara found Julian back in the nursery, Sophie asleep against his shoulder, one of his hands resting protectively over her small back, while he watched the sunset bleed orange and pink across the water beyond the estate's tall windows. "How did it go today?" he asked quietly, careful not to wake the baby. "She left with her contact information updated and a plan for the next step," Clara said, settling onto the couch beside him, exhaustion and satisfaction mingling in equal measure after a long day. "That's a win. Small but real. You're good at this," Julian said, "better than good. I've watched you build something out of the worst thing that ever happened to either of us, and turn it into something that actually helps people survive the same thing." Clara studied him for a moment. This man who had once treated her as a liability to be managed and disposed of, now sitting with their sleeping daughter against his chest, speaking about her work with genuine admiration rather than the transactional calculation that had once defined every interaction between them. "You've changed," she said. "I still notice it. Every day. I don't think I'll ever stop noticing it. Honestly, it still surprises me sometimes. I had to change," Julian said simply. "The man I was before would have lost everything that actually matters." He nearly did. "I'm not interested in going back to being someone who measures people by their usefulness instead of their worth." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb Sophie's sleep, and for a long moment they simply sat together in the quiet, watching the last light fade over the water. 2 people who had rebuilt something worth having out of the wreckage of what one terrible decision had nearly destroyed. "I used to think respect had to be demanded," Julian said eventually, his voice thoughtful, quieter than the boardroom certainty he'd once carried into every conversation. "Taken by force, if necessary, held onto through fear, because fear felt more reliable than trust. You taught me something different. Respect that actually lasts has to be built, slowly, through action, through consistency, through choosing someone's well-being over your own convenience even when nobody's watching to make sure you do it." "That's a good lesson," Clara said softly. "Took you long enough to learn it. Better late than never," Julian said, and Clara felt him smile against the top of her head. They stayed like that until the sun disappeared completely below the water, the room settling into a soft, comfortable darkness, and Clara thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the worst night of her life had somehow led directly to the best version of it. Julian Vance had gone to the airport that morning 8 months ago, intending to secure an empire built on calculation and control. He had walked away from that same airport with something he'd never actually planned for. Something that had cost him everything he thought he wanted and given him. In exchange, the one thing that had actually turned out to be worth fighting for in the first place. A family built not on ownership or fear, but on the slow, deliberate, ongoing work of treating each other as equals, worthy of respect, worthy of trust, worthy of a love that asked nothing more than honesty in return. In the end, this story is not only about a mafia boss, a betrayed woman, or a child born in the middle of danger. It is about the price of treating love like a weakness, and the power of a woman who refuses to be broken. Julian Vance believed control was everything. He thought every risk could be calculated, every person could be measured, every painful decision could be justified as business. But Clara Hayes became the one truth he could not control. She was not a liability. She was not a loose end. She was a woman with courage, intelligence, and a heart strong enough to survive abandonment, fear, and captivity. Clara's journey teaches us that real strength does not always look loud. Sometimes strength is a pregnant woman hiding evidence in the lining of a cheap canvas bag. Sometimes it is walking for hours with nothing but fear behind you and hope in front of you. Sometimes it is refusing to let a powerful man define your worth, even when the whole world has tried to make you feel small. Clara did not wait to be rescued. She built her own way out, piece by piece in silence. And Julianne's journey reminds us that regret means nothing unless it becomes action. An apology is only the beginning. Love is not proven by words, money, or protection after the damage is done. Love is proven by humility, sacrifice, and the willingness to face the consequences of your own mistakes. Julian had to learn that power without compassion is empty, and an empire means nothing if it costs you the people who truly matter. The deepest lesson of this story is simple. Never mistake someone's kindness for weakness, and never mistake someone's silence for surrender. Clara was hurt, but she was never defeated. She was afraid, but she was never powerless. And when the truth finally came into the light, it was not violence or money that changed everything. It was courage. It was motherhood. It was the decision to protect what is innocent, even when the world around you is falling apart. So if this story leaves us with one message, it is this. The people we discard may be the very people who carry the truth that can save us. And sometimes, the strongest person in the room is not the man with the empire, the guards, or the name everyone fears. Sometimes, it is the woman who has lost everything, but still stands, still fights, and still chooses life. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.